Hey everybody, this is Pete Bartolozzi welcoming you to another class session. And we're continuing with the book of Exodus. And last session, we were kind of coming to the end of chapter 3, looking at the last few verses of some things that God was telling him. Of course, we're still at the burning bush experience here. And he was telling him that God said, when this is all over, I'll give favor uh, your people, the Hebrews, favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and that they will go. It says every woman will go and borrow of her neighbor, and of her that sojourns in her house for jewels of silver and jewels of gold and raiment, and shall put them on their sons and upon your daughters, and you shall spoil the Egyptians. And again, we began to look at this word where it says you shall borrow, is the way the King James words it. But what's interesting is my Dake's Bible, and looking at that, and of course, in looking at the Hebrew, this word that's translated borrow here is the word sha'al. It means to ask, request, demand, require. In the 173, and this is what it states in the Dake's Bible, in 173 occurrences, the word is translated borrow only 6 times out of 173. Here, it could not possibly mean borrow in the sense that we would use the term. It should be asked, as it is in many other places. So just like a lot of these other places, one could not substitute borrow for ask in those cases, in these scores of other places, and have the intended thought. It was only that the whole nation, serving without pay for 80 to 100 years, should receive compensation for their hard labors. Of course, he says 80 to 100 years. The Jewish source I looked at said 116 years. In fact, the Chumash states this: in asking the Egyptian populace for their valuables, they were to use a word that could have two different connotations. It was implied by the word God used in conveying the command to Moses. This Hebrew word can mean borrow, as the Egyptians would have probably understood it. And it can mean request, which was the true meaning, since the Jews would not return what they were given. Consequently, in making their request, the Jews were to use an Egyptian term that would lend itself to more than one interpretation. And that's what was expressed in their thoughts. My thought is, why would the Egyptians so willingly give up their wealth and possessions, especially to those they deemed to be slaves? People they would have been raised to think that were a lesser human being and thus meant to serve them. And as we continue with what happened, we will see what actually brought the Egyptians to the place of willingly giving up all that the Jews would ask for. And that pretty much concludes chapter 3. And now as we get into chapter 4, we're still at the burning bush experience, but things will begin to conclude here in chapter 4. Will conclude here in chapter 4. And then I'm not going to read every verse again. Verses 1 through 5 is Moses giving his first excuse to God as to why, he didn't want to do this, that God shouldn't choose him, but basically said, speaking of the elders of Israel, because that's the context that was coming in from chapter 3, he said, they will not believe me, and they will nor hearken to my voice, and they'll say the Lord hasn't appeared to you. But the Lord said to him, and gave him first, he gave him 3 things, but first here he says, what's in your hand? He said, your rod. And he said, throw it on the ground, and it turned into a snake. And then he said, put forth your hand, grab it by the tail, and it would turn back into a rod. Now this is not, even though we see this, something similar to this, as we'll look at later, that does take place before Pharaoh. These signs right here that God has given him is to convince the elders of Israel that God had appeared to him. And so this occurred with them, as what will occur with him when he shows these signs to them. But God showed him, this is one of the signs that I will give you. Now, again, we're still at the burning bush experience, as I mentioned, and God is telling Moses what to do and letting him know how it will happen. When Moses says here, of course, they will not believe me, Again, it's not speaking of the Egyptians, because I guess I mentioned in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 16 is where God has told him to go to the elders of Israel and then say that God had appeared to me, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Josephus states this concerning this situation. He said, and he bid him also to take a signal of the truth of what he said by throwing his rod upon the ground, which became a serpent. It rolled itself around into folds and erected its heads, as ready to avenge itself on such as should assault it, after which it became a rod again as it was before. So again, these signs here of the rod turning the snake, and these next two signs from that begin in verse 4 and go down into verse 9, speaks of his hand becoming leprous and then turning back to normal health again, and pouring out water from the river and it become blood. And this was not the river turning to blood. He was just supposed to take some of the river water and pour it out in front of the elders to convince them. Even though we see the river turning to blood when he was with Pharaoh, this is not talking about that incident. But he said, when you do this, all these signs again were to convince the elders of Israel that God had appeared to him. And so now as we get down into verse 10, and it goes down in through verse 17, Moses gives his second excuse, where he said, I am not eloquent. And then God begins to rebuke him. He said, I'm not eloquent, but he also said, I'm slow of speech, slow of tongue. And God started, it seemed like God was a little more stern with him, saying, who made man's mouth? And he said, I did. And I'm telling you to do it, which means I ain't telling you to do something that you can't do or that I'm not equipping you to do. He didn't really put it in those words, but it seems like he was a little firm there. But because it does say in verse 14, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, because Moses was trying to find excuses not to do what God was asking him to do. But he said, is not Aaron the Levite your brother? And I know he can speak well. And then he said, of course, I will send him to be a spokesman for the people. And so that was interesting. Moses actually was, I won't say that Aaron never said anything before Pharaoh, but Moses was actually the spokesperson before Pharaoh, but Aaron was the primary spokesman before the elders of Israel, before the people of Israel. And that's actually what it says in verse 16. It says, and he, speaking of Aaron, shall be your spokesperson unto the people. Excuse me. Throat was feeling a little dry there. And it said, he shall instead be a mouth. And it said, he shall be instead of a mouth, and you shall be to him instead of a God. In other words, basically, he'll get word from God, and then he'll pass the word on to Aaron on what to say unto them, and so on. And then he said, you take your rod, and you'll do all these signs. Moses had once been trained in Egypt and led Egypt's armies victorious in battle. It seems then in those early years, he was trained in the public speaking, at least in how to present himself and speak in the royal court. This is evidence that these second 40 years of his life removed Egypt from him, and God could now make him into the man that he wanted to be. Again, where we mentioned before, where when he killed the Egyptian, and at the end of those first 40 years there, he kind of had this idea that I am he. And then here at the end of 40 years in the desert after that, he'd come to, who am I? And make it excuses here. So now this brings us to the end of the burning bush experience. So in verse 18 of chapter 4, Moses goes and tells Jethro, his father-in-law, and Jethro gives his blessing to go back to Egypt and see how Israel's doing. Verse 19, he leaves for Egypt. He gets a donkey, puts his wife and sons upon that, and starts heading for Egypt. And of course it says Moses had the rod of God in his hand. So his rod now becomes the rod of God, something that God will use as he works with Moses, his chosen leader. Now, and then in verse 21 through 23, we have saying that Moses was returning to Egypt, and then God reminds him, when you go to Egypt, that and do all that I've put in your hand. He said that Pharaoh will harden his heart. And then he said, you will say to Pharaoh, in verse 22, that Israel is my firstborn. And so the thing is, Pharaoh would understand this. His firstborn, I mean, it was of essence. He was taking care of the best. He was because he's going to be his heir. So he understood his firstborn. And so he told Moses to tell him, Israel's my firstborn. If anybody would touch Pharaoh's son, they were going to get it from Pharaoh, most likely even die. And so when God told Moses, you tell him Israel's my firstborn, then you see, God said, don't mess with my firstborn. And as God, he's higher than Pharaoh, even though Pharaoh seems to have another idea. Of course, the Pharaohs believed they were gods. And so anyway, and so I'm going to read this. We looked a little bit of this about, hardening Pharaoh's heart and so on. And I just want to bring out a little bit more, because last time I read from Brother Hagin, I'm reading from Dakes, and I believe this is where, Brother Hagin got some of his information, because he did have a Dakes Bible. And he said many times, and so this is the Dakes Bible, he said that many times God is said to do things he permits to be done. God gave Pharaoh the occasion to resist him, to submit to him or harden his heart. In the same way, the gospel saves or damns, softens or hardens, makes alive and kills all who hear it today. Well, I wouldn't say it makes it kill, but it saves or damns, softens or hardens. Any judgment or calamity which does not break the nature and subdue the life only hardens it. As the sun hardens clay and softens the wax, so is it with truth. The results are not in the sun or in God, but in the materials, the heart. Brother Hagin once spoke of a man who he went to speak to on several occasions about accepting the Lord and getting things right with his family, who he had left. He said that this man would shake and cry under the conviction of the Holy Spirit, but would say, I know you're right, but I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. And he went on to say that this man died in his sin. How people respond is not on God, nor on the messenger, but on the man and the condition of his heart. So, and then concerning the firstborn, the Dakes Bible has this note as well. It says, here God calls the nation of Israel his son and firstborn, as contrasted with the firstborn of Egypt. God was telling him that he loved Israel as Pharaoh himself loved his firstborn. One of the biblical standards of judgment, of course, this is me speaking now. One of the biblical standards of judgment is that in the same measure you meet, it will be measured to you again. If Pharaoh continues to violate and freely kill, burden and oppress, and even, killing a slave was not a real big deal, and freely kill Israel, God's firstborn, then Pharaoh is setting things up for his firstborn to be killed. And in the end, we know that's what takes place. So, and we'll look at that a little further later, and I'll talk some more about that. But now as we come to verse 24 and 25, and of course we're here in chapter 4, verse 24 actually through 26, 3 verses, there's something that's rather interesting happens, and so I'm going to actually read these verses. And it says, and it came to pass, beginning with verse 24, and it came to pass by the way in the inn that the Lord met him and sought to kill him. Then Zipporah took a sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son and cast it at his feet, and said, surely a bloody husband you are to me. So he let him go. Then she said, a bloody husband you are, because of the circumcision. There has been a lot of misunderstanding concerning these verses. The way these verses read, it sounds like God is seeking to kill Moses. Now you're going to find some of the things that I say here are going to be different than what most people say anymore. But in looking at these things and seeing the context and what was said, it's very clear. But anyway, this verse sounds like God's coming to kill Moses. First of all, we have to remember that the separation of causative and permissive is not clear in the Hebrew language, and everything sounds causative, even though often permissive is expressed. It doesn't make sense that God would appear to Moses in such a supernatural way, a burning bush that wasn't consumed, and talk to him out of it, and call him back to Egypt to fulfill his purpose and reveal things that would happen when he got there, and then go and kill him on his way to Egypt in obedience to God. Again, this would be a kingdom divided against itself, and once more, according to Jesus' own words, his kingdom couldn't stand. So what's going on here? Even though there are only 3 verses about this incident, the wording here reveals quite a bit of information concerning what is going on. God, again, does not go about killing his own, especially when they're obeying him in what he had directed them to do. The phrase, "and he sought to kill him," is similar to what took place with David when he numbered Israel. We've talked about this in an earlier episode. Remember, or an earlier class, I should say. Remember, the account recorded in 1 Samuel, where it sounded like God moved David to number Israel and then judged him for doing so, which is where we first talked about, this couldn't be so, God moving him to do something that he would judge him for. And that's a kingdom divided against itself. This is where we first mentioned it. But whereas the same account recorded in 2 Chronicles reveals that it was Satan who moved David to number Israel, not God. So there was a qualifying verse when we were talking about that. God had definitely come to meet with Moses here because he knew that Satan was going to try to kill Moses. It is Satan that tries to kill God's people to keep them from fulfilling their call, as it always works against his demented, perverted plans. The record here reveals that the only way Moses was saved from death was that his wife was to circumcise one of his sons, obviously the younger one, or it seems obvious to me. We know that circumcision was required of God as a sign of the covenant, and that he had established with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It is clear that one of his sons, because Moses had 2 sons by Zipporah, and it only says that she circumcised one of her sons. So it is clear here that one of his sons had not been circumcised. It is also clear by the comments that Zipporah made that she was opposed to circumcision. Obviously, Moses revealed to her the covenant that Israel had with God and the sign of that covenant in circumcision. Now, being familiar with this, or not being familiar with this, she let Moses circumcise their firstborn, but after seeing what took place, she became clearly against it, no doubt because of her baby's crying and tending to the healing afterwards. Moses would not have neglected to circumcise his second son, except Zipporah opposed it. Even though it was Satan who influenced David to number Israel, he couldn't have caused David to do it against his will. David had to yield to him to give him place. The same with Moses here. He had to give Satan place to kill him. That place came when he yielded to Satan's influence through Zipporah's emotions and thus her opposition to circumcision. So why didn't Satan try to kill Moses at the time of his second son's birth? Having run Moses out of Egypt to the backside of the desert, he then was of no consequence to Satan's plans until Moses accepted God's call to be his emissary to deliver his people from Egypt and was heading back in obedience to God. So now Satan took advantage of this avenue to kill Moses. And the only reason Zipporah circumcised her youngest son was obviously because Moses, or possibly Aaron who was with him, told her the reason he was dying was because of his refusal to circumcise his younger son. So she circumcised him, throwing the foreskin at his feet, and said that he was a bloody husband because of the circumcision. And this is stated twice in these 3 verses. Her statement was not a covenant statement, as some have tried to say, but a criticism of the sign of the covenant, and thus a rejection of the covenant of God with Abraham, and in essence, a rejection of the God of the covenant. At this point, we don't see Zipporah again with Moses until Moses brings Israel to Midian, and she and her sons and their sons were with her father Jethro. In Exodus chapter 18, verse 2, it states that Moses sent her back to her father. It was obviously here that he sent her back, as he could not fulfill the purpose of God upon his life with a wife who rejected God and his covenant. And I dare say that because of her despising circumcision, that she asked to leave and did not want to continue with him, not only on this journey, but as his wife. Even after hearing, because Moses, when this is all over and they go to Midian, Moses meets Jethro, Zipporah and her sons are with her father-in-law, as I talked about in Exodus 18. And but anyway, when he met with them, even after hearing how miraculously God delivered them and all the plagues that were sent and all that happened, the Red Sea crossing, and of course the world at that time, and what was going on was destroyed Egypt. And you can be assured a world power, when they're destroyed, man, everybody's hearing about it. So not just through Moses, she was hearing through all the sources that Egypt had been destroyed, had been devastated. And even after all that, and hearing about the destruction of Egypt and the process and all, she still didn't desire to repent and restore things with Moses at that time, where he met his father-in-law, and Zipporah and her sons were there, because she didn't go with him, she didn't stay with him, she did not restore things. So, and then later it says Moses married an Ethiopian woman. So now in verse 27 through 31, now you got to understand holistic thinking. In Eastern cultures, we think chronologically. They think holistically, where sometimes they tell a portion of the story and then it kind of changes, and they fill in some more information in that story. But since the description of it comes after that, we think it's chronological, but it's not, because in verse 27, where the Lord spoke to Aaron, said, go into the wilderness and meet Moses, and he said he met him at the Mount of God, which was Mount Sinai. Well, the narration before, Moses was on his way to Egypt. He wasn't at Mount Sinai. So this is not chronological conversation. It's just now going in and filling information about God sending Aaron to meet Moses, because Moses had said, I'm not eloquent and slow of speech and slow of tongue, and God got upset at him, but he said, look, I'll send Aaron to you. I know he can speak well, and he'll speak to the people, to the Hebrews, and he would be your voice to them. But anyways, now it's just filling in that God had spoke to Aaron, because obviously as they're going back to Egypt, Aaron was already with them, because he had met him at Mount Sinai when they were still in Midian. And so we see all this. But anyway, and this is kind of how it ends. And it says that the people, and they got to Israel, Aaron spoke for him, and it said the people believed them, which means the elders as well believed them. As it said, God told him that, and they bowed their heads and worshiped God, and because he showed the signs, they believed, and so on. And so that finishes up that chapter. Now we're getting into chapter 5. And here now, chapter 5 begins with Moses and Aaron, their first appearance before Pharaoh in his court, and where they said, "Let my people go." I'm not going to read all the verses, but anyway, we see Moses, or Pharaoh's, beginning to harden his heart. He's rejecting this word. He, like I said, they think he's a god. He's the ruler of Egypt, And who is this Moses to come and say, let Israel go and serve their God? And so Pharaoh, in response to this, shows his hardness of heart by claiming, it said, King James says, for they are idols, basically saying, for you're lazy. These slaves are lazy. Obviously, they don't have enough work to do because they want time off to go worship their God, go out in the desert and worship their God. Obviously, they don't have enough to do for them to even think about stuff like this, so they need more work. So now all of a sudden he withholds the straw, as we know the story, and usually the straw was provided for them to make bricks. Now they got to go get the straw and make the bricks. It didn't work, and he was hard on them, beating the taskmasters, which were Jews themselves. And he's saying, look, you're giving us too much work to do. And he says, you're idle because you're asking to do this. Or literally, you're lazy. So again, Pharaoh's heart of pride is showing itself just as God told Moses. It's now becoming hard, and he's taking it out on the Jews. When people become hard, they take it out on other people. And sad to say, they do it to those under their authority. So now verse 15, it goes down through verse 22. Israel, now the Jews that believed him because of the signs and so on, now they're coming and they're mad at him, and look what you're doing to us. And he's doing harder things on us, giving more work to do, and he's, you made things worse for us, Moses, because he says you're lazy, because you want to go sacrifice to the Lord. And so they said, the Lord look upon you and judge you, Moses, because of what you've done to us. And so we're abhorred in the eyes of Pharaoh now because of this. And so Moses, needless to say, he just got back. He just had this experience with God, but he gets there, and now all of this is happening. So even Moses, in verse 22, Moses returned to the Lord and said, Lord, wherefore have you so evil entreated this people? Why is it that you have sent me? So his question is, call, why have you sent me? And because he went and spoke to Pharaoh. And so anyway, the Dake's Bible has this notice: says Pharaoh laid the blame to the laziness of the people caused by religion, because they wanted to sacrifice to God. But my time is up. We'll continue with this next time. So I thank you for sitting in on this class session. And until next time, be blessed.